Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Mountaineer Locker Room. Then and now, I'm Greg Christ, joined by, of course, Mr. Frank Fear. And it is an absolute pleasure to finally be back on the air with you guys. Every time Wednesday rolls around, seems like an issue pops up for me. But this time I made sure that it didn't, Frank. And then I had everything planned. I was sitting here in front of my computer eating some wings at about 6:25. Thought, well, I'll finish my dinner. Well, I'll go ahead and get on my email, see if the link is there yet. I couldn't get on my email, and I spent the next 20 minutes trying to figure out how to get it.
Oh, boy.
Microsoft wouldn't let me on. I had to change my password 4 or 5 times. So my wings are still sitting here waiting on me for after the show. So that's a good thing. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here again, and looking forward to another great show tonight. I think we got a good one.
Well, Greg, it's just so fantastic to have you back and to be our leadoff hitter. And I was telling someone the other day, when I want to get an IQ uplift on Mountaineer sports, particularly basketball, but also football, I talk with Greg, and you're inductee into the Sports Legend Hall of Fame, and there's good reason for that. So it's been a while, and hopefully this will be not an intermission, but we'll be back every Wednesday night. So God bless you, buddy.
Well, I tell everybody how smart I am. My wife would tend to disagree, and I'm not nearly as smart as I act like I am. Let's just put it that way. But what was the old saying? You can dazzle them with diamonds, or baffle them with something else, or something to that effect. That's kind of my mantra. So I'll stick with that. Got all kinds of stuff to talk about. I know we're going to have our guest on here. I think we're going to do that off the top here. You were fortunate enough, and I'm going to let you do the introduction on this, but you were fortunate enough to do this interview again when I was a no-show. It bailed out on you the last minute. It was, I've listened to parts of it, a great interview, and I think people are really going to enjoy this.
Well, Greg, you and I have talked a lot over the last couple of years about how blessed we are in the Mountain State to have the collection of folks who are supporting and are the voice, in Tony Caridi's case, of Mountaineer football, Mountaineer basketball, and Jed Drenning. Many people know, obviously, as the sideline reporter during football season, but also in the Gun podcast, a great podcast. We strongly recommend it. And he's our guest, Jed Drenning. And I have to admit that one of the things that I didn't know about Jed was just how good an athlete he was, both in high school and in college.
Yep.
I wasn't in West Virginia when he was playing high school and college ball. So this guy, fantastic high school player.
Yeah.
And then 10,000 yards as a quarterback at Glenville. He's in the Glenville, your alma mater. He's in the Glenville University Hall of Fame. And went, go ahead. You're going to say something.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to go ahead and say this before we get him on. I hadn't been back to Glenville for a while. I don't remember what year it was, but I knew they had a really good football team. And I thought, I'm going to go up and watch them. So I made a trip up to watch Glenville play. He was the quarterback. He had a receiver. I think his last name was George, who ended up was top in the, maybe a record setter in all of the NCAA, broke all of Jerry Rice's records. They were unbelievable, and he could throw that football. My goodness. And of course it was Rich Rod's offense. So they threw it. They threw it around, and it was so much fun to watch him play. And I know a lot of people don't remember how good a quarterback he was. I guess he'd gone to WVU and then transferred down to Glenville, so they kind of forgot about him. But I got to see him play. I got to see him play twice. My goodness, he could throw that ball.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, too, about Glenville and going to see him play, and the fact that he played under Rich Rod. He'll talk about that a bit in the tape you're going to hear. But he played under Rich Rod. He obviously was at West Virginia for a bit under Don Nealon, and then he went to Samford, Samford, which is Bobby Bowden's alma mater. Right. It wasn't called Samford in those days, but he played under Terry Bowden there. So this guy, and also he played under Jimbo Fisher at Glenville. So here's a guy that really has a pedigree. And I mentioned earlier about your breadth and depth of knowledge about athletics I'll tell you what, I was mentioning before the show to you and Darren, as I was interviewing him, I wanted to apply for college credit because what he does, and it fits our show perfectly, and we appreciate him taking the time to do this. Our show is then and now, and what he's going to do is give us a tour of college football history. He's going to call it college football 1.0, and then he's going to go from historically to where we are now and where he thinks we're going to go in the future. And I'll tell you what, I think he has it figured out. There is no question
Yep.
in my mind that what he's talking about is grounded. This not the Jed is not a bloviator, but what he says is well reasoned and thought out. So it's a rather long interview, about 29 minutes, but
Yep.
it's worth it. It's on the phone. Unfortunately, because of conflicts, he couldn't be with us live tonight. But you've listened to it, I've listened to it, and I think the audience is really going to benefit by it.
Yep. I think so too.
So, Darren, anytime you're ready, let it rip.
Yep.
Well, I would say before you go micro, it's best to go macro. And when you look at the game at large and the transformation that we've seen it undergo in recent years, um, as I often categorize it, college football 1.0 was a great game. It was an incredible game. It started with Rutgers Princeton in 1869, and it lasted all the way up through 2020, maybe even into April 2021 when NIL was passed and get into that summer and the game changed the season of 2021, and that was the end of college football 1.0. Now, when you look at West Virginia's track record in college football 1.0 as a developmental program, it was phenomenal. You know, we were top 15 all time in wins. We had tremendous success with a lot of banner BCS bowl wins. We consistently overachieved by recruiting what I would consider undervalued assets. Sometimes some kids who probably should have received more offers than they did, who arrived with a chip on their shoulder. They couldn't understand why they were a 3-star when they consistently beat the 4-star down the street in high school. So they showed up with an axe to grind and they fit right in. And we would take those kids and for the duration of 4, sometimes 5 years, develop them through, talent development, strength and conditioning, technique, and turn them in oftentimes into NFL players. We've had historically way more than our fair share of NFL players, including a lot of first round picks. So we did that as a developmental program by taking these kids over the course of 4 and 5 years and developing them. Well, that was college football 1.0. And again, I can't state it enough, that's over. We now reside in college football 2.0. And the changes that took place, whether it's the portal, whether it's NIL, whether it's a combination of both those things, they've impacted all programs. The SEC Blue Bloods and the Big Ten Blue Bloods, they lack the depth that they once enjoyed when they had these super teams not long ago. But when you look at developmental programs like West Virginia, it's kind of been a dagger straight to the heart of developmental programs. So we've had to find a way to adjust and pivot, recalibrate, and find our way north in this new reality. And that's what we're trying to do. And one of the positives with it is, as you move out of what has been basically a purely NIL kind of setting, where name, image, likeness, and trusts and collectives were basically the only thing that was driving the engine. You move out of that model into more of a revenue sharing model, which will start this year, and it gives programs like West Virginia, I think, more of a puncher's chance. If you can get to that full share, which is what we're trying to do, and I think Ren can get us there. If you can get to that full share, I think we can climb in the hierarchy of how much we're spending within the conference and how competitive we can be against those other teams. And to that end, I think Rich is arriving at a perfect time as we experience and start to undergo some of those changes.
Yeah, boy, I really appreciate that framing, Jed, because you know it as well as I. I mean, so many of the fans, I'm included, we want our teams to win, but the question is, everything is of a context, and if you don't understand the context, if you don't appreciate the context, then you miss the sort of the circumstances in which winning or losing or whatever becomes a part of. So I think you really nailed it with that framing that it's not college football, not college football. I mean, it moves through phases, it evolves. And the last point you made, I think, really bears reinforcing that Rich Rod's coming at the right time, not just in the evolution of WVU football, but as the sport itself, the industry, so to speak, is evolving into its next iteration with the revenue sharing. Because, and a lot of people, I don't think, understand that, Jed, that revenue sharing may be, if not the elixir, at least an opportunity pathway for institutions like West Virginia University, and your emphasis on the important role that Ren Baker plays in this is absolutely critical. So I thank you for that.
Well, and there's, of course, as with anything in this new frontier, every time there's a step that's taken, it's countered with some form of litigation or some form of administrative push. And what we've seen here as we move toward the House decision and what that's going to have the new landscape look like starting July 1st, whether it's pushback from the Department of Education saying that, hey, not so fast, Title IX applies to this as well. So even that rev share, which is going to be 22% of the average overall income athletically for your power schools, which is going to be in the ballpark of $20 to $22 million. They're saying that even that has to be equally distributed as per Title IX. There'll be litigation there where that settles or sorts itself out. Nobody knows. But none of these things are easy steps to take. I mean, in effect, what you had happen was, for the better part of 40 years, there was a Supreme Court case in 1984 called the Board of Regents case. And in large measure, people viewed that as the Supreme Court kind of telling the NCAA, hey, we're going to defer to you when it comes to managing amateur athletics. We're going to rule in such a way as to we're going to leave the ball in your court, no pun intended, as to how you handle amateur athletics. And for the next 40 years, at every turn, the NCAA's answer to everything, when it was suggested, hey, maybe you ought to throw the kids a couple extra bucks so their parents can travel to a game, or maybe you ought to supersize some of these scholarships. Maybe you ought to, you're now making not just hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars as an enterprise. Maybe throw the kids a little extra this or a little extra that. And their response every time, uniformly, without exception, was, nope, they got a scholarship and that's enough. Well, I do believe had they extended, a series of olive branches during that 40-year period, we might not have reached the point that we did. But instead, for 40 years, they ruled with an iron fist. And here you come with the Alston case and the Supreme Court, which, I mean, if they're trying to decide if the sky is blue, the Supreme Court can't unilaterally decide on that. They'd rule 5-4 if the sky is blue. Well, this is something they agreed 9-0 against the NCAA, basically saying, who do you think you are? This is America. You can't stop these kids from doing these things. So what's happened is there's fear in the next step to take because you don't want antitrust sanctions or penalties slapped on you. So everybody has great ideas. I think we should just do X, Y, or Z. Well, you need to game that through the process and ask yourself, all right, will that result in standing before the Supreme Court and having penalties slapped on me, whatever the case might be? But that's where we're heading. Looks like we're on some level, in some form, heading out of just NIL. NIL will still exist, but it won't be the only impetus behind things. If you do have a rev share model, that will be somewhat of an equalizer, but you'll still have things happening like, for instance, United Airlines. I've heard chatter that they might, as from an NIL standpoint, sponsor the Georgia quarterback room. Okay, that's above and beyond the revenue share that the Georgia roster will get. So you'll still have those types of things. Like I told people before, if you want to understand what NIL is, it's like this. Many have suggested, why don't we just have some kind of salary cap? And that would seem to stabilize and fix this thing. I'm like, well, yes and no. Think of the NFL. The NFL does, in fact, have a salary cap that, changes each year. What's it up to? 230 or 240 million per team, whatever it's at right now. But the NFL is able to, with its salary cap, tell the Kansas City Chiefs two things. First of all, you have to spend at least this amount because we want you to be competitive. We're not going to let you do what the Pittsburgh Pirates do and not spend anything. The NFL forces you to spend enough to be competitive. But on the other side of the spectrum, you can't spend beyond the cap amount. Now, you can pay a guy like Patrick Mahomes whatever you want, but you have to put together your 53-man roster with all of that money within the confines of the cap space you have. There's a limit on that, right? So there's, in effect, a limit on what you can pay Patrick Mahomes. But you know what there's not a limit on? There's not a limit on how much Patrick Mahomes can make from State Farm commercials. That's NIL. Name, image, likeness is the State Farm commercial. And if you want to understand at the college level, that's kind of what you're dealing with.
Well, you're right on target. And you know, the NCAA, so many people want the NCAA to do something. And it's much more complex than that, obviously. And then when they made the leadership change, appointing as president Charlie, came as a governor of Massachusetts, thinking that the pathway is going to be it's going to be through Congress, and we're going to get regulation through Congress. But as you say, I mean. When you look at the various options and you look at what these various entities, what they normally focus on, intercollegiate athletics isn't going to be at the top of the food chain with respect, even though a number of members of Congress, including, Joe Manchin, Tommy Tuberville, a variety of other people got in there. Clearly, congressional federal regulation wasn't going to be the way that it was going to go.
Well, there needs to be uniformity.
Yeah, that's right.
So Charlie Baker petitions, members of the House, members of the Senate. What he's looking at is this. There are 30 some odd state laws that impact on varying levels or varying degrees what NIL can and can't do.
That's right.
You can't function as a governing institution like the NCAA. You can't function like that in 50 states with 30 some different state laws saying 30 some different things. So what they're saying is they're asking the federal government, can you at least intervene to solve that portion of it? Mm-hmm. We need some level of uniformity here, which we have none of. Now, what kind of timeline we might be looking at as to whether or not that happens, that's anybody's guess.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And that is something that gets lost, that if you have to look at it, it's easy to basically overlay our thoughts on the NCAA, but you have to look at it from the point of view of what the NCAA administration prefers, and you nailed it. It's uniformity, and it makes sense if you're in that catbird seat. What are your thoughts in terms of the dynamics of these major conferences right now? We've got the Power Four, had the Power Five until many of the former Pac-12 schools moved to different conferences because of the media deal following through on the West Coast. What's your take on the power conferences right now, and also very important to us, obviously, where the Big 12 fits into the mix?
It's hard to give names to these conferences that have any kind of meaning. It was the LSU athletic director back in 2011 that was the first to tweet, we're one day going to end up with two conferences, Conference ESPN and Conference Fox. Well, to some extent, we've been heading toward that ever since, but you'll also have, some sort of streaming intervention involved. But again, when you look at these things, big picture, here's kind of what you're looking at. And I've heard Rick Neuheisel talk about this very eloquently. There's a parallel to be drawn between probably on some level what has to happen here and what has happened in the NFL. Start with this. I don't see these problems being resolved without the players in some fashion organizing, whether you want to call it a union, whatever label you want to slap on it, and collectively bargaining what it is they're looking for. But the issue is there's nobody to sit down at a table and negotiate with because there's no commissioner on the other side. There's no college football czar. Every conference has its own commissioner with its own agenda. There's all kind of college presidents involved. So there's not one uniform voice representing all. That's part of the issue. When you look at what happened with the NFL, and this is parallel to what's going on with these different, TV contracts with different, people and conferences being so extreme. The difference between the ACC contract and the Big Ten contract. Back in the 1960s, when Pete Rozelle was the commissioner of the NFL, he had a vision for what the league could be. But he recognized to reach that vision and to achieve that vision and make it reality, he had to control all the inventory that the league had. And he had to be able to go to the negotiation table with the media partners, with the TV partners, handling all the inventory with no loose hanging inventory with carve-out deals. Well, the issue he encountered was Chicago had its own deal with, was it NBC Chicago? The Bears did. The Giants had their own deal with, I think, maybe CBS New York. So they looked at him like he was crazy. Like, why would we give you our inventory when we already have these sweetheart deals carved out regionally or locally in our local market? Why would we give that up? He said, you just got to trust me. If you give me all the inventory, that gives me the authority to broker the best deal for all of us. It took some time to get the Giants and the Bears to come around to that thinking, but ultimately he did. They gave up the inventory. He handled it all. Now, fast forward 60 years past that point, or half a century at least past that point, the NFL right now is a $20 billion with a B dollar enterprise. $1 billion. Now, Roger Goodell, the current commissioner, has said he has a goal of $25 billion by 2027. I'm not betting against him.
Yeah.
Now, compare that to college football, which is the second most popular sport in America. The NFL with 32 teams is at $20 billion a year. College football with 60 plus power conference schools and other 60 plus group of conference schools is about $3.5 billion or so. That number is constantly changing. So the feeling is very much that a lot of money is being left on the table as the second most popular sport in America. If you come together and have some element of solidarity and get the Big Ten and the SEC to have the vision to recognize, yes, it's great to be an 800-pound gorilla in a $3.5 billion market. That's great. Why would you give that up? Well, I'll tell you why you would give that up. Wouldn't it be better to be a sizable gorilla in a $10 billion market? You will make far more money. That's why. So at the end of all these interests, the dollar is recognized as what's the driving force for all these conferences. Once they recognize that to be true, I do think you'll see some sort of considerable change affected, but it's going to take that thinking to change. Right now, the SEC thinks like, why would we ever do that? So does the Big Ten. Why would we give up what we currently have? We rule the day. Well, that's why you might want to consider giving up what you have to triple the size of the market. And a lot of people think those numbers that we can experience that.
Yeah, you're talking about the United States of college football and the SEC and Big Ten. Another great insight there, Jed. It, very much like the Bears and the Giants of decades ago. But you know, you're absolutely correct in talking about the fact that when you look at the NFL and the behemoth it is, how did it get there? Number one, and number two, when you then compare it to college football. With the size it has and the much more national scope to it. I've read this, 15 times. There's much more that's available. Now, the big question many everyday, I think many everyday fans are asking, okay, I understand now. Well, I understand that, Jed. Thank you. But can we go back to regional based college football? Is that ever going to happen where, I mean, you look at West Virginia, we play Syracuse, Pitt every year. We play Virginia Tech. And you can say the same thing in the Midlands and certainly now in the West Coast. Do you think there's and I'm asking to look at the crystal ball, any chance that in the future iterations, evolution of this, that will return back to where it was, as you said, in college football, at least one aspect of college football 1.0?
Again, if you remove the timeline piece from it and just leave it open-ended, because the game's been changing since the game started. So this transformation that we're undergoing now is just the latest transformation. It's going to continue to reshape itself. There's going to continue to be new realignment. I think you're going to see some level of significant change when most of these current media deals start to toll, which will be toward the end of this decade, going into the next decade, outside of the ACC, which by the letter of the law right now, technically on paper, is through 2036. I think I don't see that happening. I just grant of rights or not, I don't see the ACC as we know it existing in 2036. I think there'll be a shakeup of some kind as these new media deals cooler minds will prevail when people recognize the dollar value of working together.
Mhm.
And when the new media deals come about here in, I guess we're in 2025, we're talking in 5-ish years, 6-ish years, whatever it might be. You could have some sort of shakeup. And if you remove the labels ACC and Big 12, and if you start looking at it, if the ACC as we know it is kind of fragmented, what I could see happening, it would make a lot of sense and a lot of dollars, which is why it could happen. What the ACC might consider it scraps. One man's trash is another man's treasure, right?
Mhm.
A lot of our old Big East counterparts, we could end up in some form of alignment. This is just me guessing with Virginia Tech and Pitt and Louisville and perhaps Boston College. Who knows? I could see that taking shape at some point down the road for sure, because I don't know if there's room for 4 power conferences. So once they break up and take whatever new shape they're going to take in a handful of years, what's that going to look like? Well, maybe that's where the regional piece of it starts to come back into play.
Yeah.
And you start to division things out, you start to conference things out. So I could see us with some of our regional counterparts, because right now we've been at somewhat of a disadvantage compared to the rest of the Big 12 in terms of what we feel compelled to do from a non-conference scheduling standpoint. We were the only team in America that for 4 consecutive years scheduled 11 Power 5 schools. No other team in America did that. Not USC, not Notre Dame. Now, why we did that was to offer something to our fans. Most of the rest of the Big 12, or at least the Big 12 that we traditionally played in until the last couple of years, those teams, their rivalry games were within the conference. So their fan bases were able to travel to the rivalry games while playing a conference game. And they were able to travel to those games. So what they did was, by and large, they took their non-conference schedule and they said, all right, let's make it a much more manageable situation. Perhaps one P5, one G5, one FCS. Meanwhile, West Virginia didn't have the luxury. Our fans couldn't travel to any of our Big 12 games. Again, before Cincinnati was around, I'm talking to the original iteration that we entered in 2012. We couldn't travel to any games. The closest road game was Iowa State, almost 1,000 miles away. So administratively, what we did was we extended an opportunity for them. I'll tell you what we'll do. While the rest of the league's kind of taking it easy, we won't. We'll beef up our non-conference schedule and play Virginia Tech and Penn State. But now I hope you bear in mind that means that our 6-6 is everybody else's 7-5. But people kind of lose sight of that. Now, Ren also recognizes in the new landscape of things, as things start to take shape and reshape, we would like to move much more toward a model that the rest of the Big 12 and the rest of our peers are playing, which is what's going to happen next year. You're going to see us play one FCS. We travel to Athens to play one G5 in Ohio University because that was a 2-for-1 deal. Instead of paying them to come to Morgantown, we go there once. It's a deal that Shane struck years ago, and they come to Morgantown later on twice. And then, of course, we play Pitt in the Brawl. So we're going to have the same non-conference schedule as the rest of the Big 12 in the sense that it's an FCS, a G5, and a P5 instead of 11 Power 5s on our schedule, beating ourselves up. Right? So our fans have an opportunity to watch these regional games that they know and love. So that's what things are moving towards. But I do think at the end of the day, at some point, you're going to see this become somewhat more regional than it currently is. I just don't know what that's going to look like.
Yeah, another great set of insights there. Really, when you think about, again, putting things in perspective, we know what's happening, but why, and what does it look like, and just scratching the surface to get to that. And I always tell people, I said, right now we've got competition, uber competition between and among the conferences. Think about that. The similar, a pattern would be to look at the NFL and you would say, okay, the NFL West is going to compete against, the AFC East. Well, it doesn't happen. Those are basically collections of teams that have some proximity, but they don't compete with each other. They're under one canopy, the NFL, with one person who's the czar. So and this. These things take time. I'm glad you emphasized that and went back to the evolution of the NFL. It takes the right leader, Pete Rozelle was, to be able to be not to be a bully about it, but to basically take the time that it needed to get to where he wanted to go. And particularly in today's time, people want, snap the finger change. Sometimes that happens, but when you look at history, it often works just the other way, and it takes good old-fashioned leadership from a
Yeah.
person who knows what they're doing and has a vision, and is not just a manager. And then when you compare the
Yes.
NFL, with the other professional conferences, well, you can draw your own conclusion, but conclusion I draw is the NFL is light years ahead, and the proof is in the pudding. Jed, this has been
I,
fantastic. I know how busy you are, so for you taking the time, and I feel like my football IQ has gone up at least 20 points. Any final comments, thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think that West Virginia is headed in the right direction. We have the right leadership in the right places. Uh, and I do think, and I felt this since the outset, that playoff expansion is a critical move in the right direction for programs like West Virginia. What happens is the 14 playoff created an opportunity for the bluest of the blue bloods to kind of have a death grip on the sport with what I would consider super teams, the three best at every position, because the most coveted recruits want to play on the biggest of stages for the biggest prizes in the championship, right? Well, that was limited to 5 or 6 teams in a 14 playoff. It was always the same suspects. But as we've expanded to a 12 team, now consider the growing list of teams that take part in that. So that's a growing list of teams that the most coveted recruits will now disperse to with an opportunity to play for the championship. Now, it wasn't that long ago that Nick Saban's Alabama Crimson Tide were losing to Georgia in the national championship game at halftime because their quarterback, Jalen Hurts, was struggling. Well, all Nick Saban had to do say, hey, Jalen, best quarterback in America when you came out of high school. Sorry you're struggling. I'm going to turn to the other best quarterback in America because he's part of my team too. Tua, get in there, second best quarterback in America. Go win the game for us now. Well, what has happened is a combination of the portal and NIL. Tua no longer plays for Alabama. You might still have Jalen Hurts playing for Alabama, but not Tua. Tua is peddling his wares somewhere else as a starter on a team that now has a chance to get into a 12-team playoff, and he's getting paid more as a starter for that team than Alabama, even with its deep pockets, could pay their backup. So it's impacting even the blue bloods from a depth standpoint, and that makes them less bulletproof than they were before. Alabama is always going to be Alabama. Ohio State's always going to be Ohio State, and so on. But they're not going to be the unbeatable version that we saw just a short handful of years ago when they were able to harvest all the talent to 4 or 5 teams.
That's right. We were talking earlier about both of us being at Michigan State at the same time. And when Mark D'Antonio had tremendous success at Michigan State, went to the college playoff one year, won the Rose Bowl. It really those were down years for Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame. No criticism, but that's what you had to do. You took advantage of your competition, and he would do a great job at recruiting 3 stars and coach them up.
Sure.
But what you just described explains Indiana. Indiana, not never, I mean, historically with a losing record, not being a factor in the Big Ten for decades, coming in with a new coach, boom, they not only have success in the Big Ten, they're in the college football playoff. So what you're saying is that opening of that door to more teams is not just a
Yes.
numbers game. It's an opportunity field for teams that
And Indiana
otherwise
was
wouldn't.
perfect storm.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
when he said, when Kurt looked at the schedule, even his wife was able to tell him, she's like, hey, but even my wife said we can win 10 games with that schedule, right?
Yeah.
And he kind of looked at it, and next thing you know, he gets double-digit transfers from JMU to come with him to help introduce the culture. And that, to somewhat, is the template we're going to be trying to follow here at West Virginia with Rich. With some of these Jack State kids coming in, you rebuild your team through the portal. The job that Kurt Signetti and I'll say and his wife were able to do in leaving James Madison and head to Indiana, take advantage of a schedule that you look at, you think you can win 9 or 10 games with, and then maybe bring some of your own kids with you to help take a shortcut from a culture standpoint. So the rest of the program understands it, but they've done a bang-up job. If that wasn't possible with a 4-team, it is possible with a 12-team. And now he can build his program off that. It's like Bill Snyder used to say, as he was trying to build Kansas State up, he thought introducing divisional play into the Big 12 was tremendous because the Big 12 never had divisions before that. They just had you win the conference or you don't. But the fact that you could win the Big 12 North and hang that banner to show recruits that you were a champion of something, that was a massive stepping stone. So those types of things do matter.
Oh, they do. They do. Well, Jed, this has been terrific. Insights galore. You have, as we said at the beginning, such a deep and broad perspective on the game, and not just the current uh, game, but also historically. So thank you so much for taking the time. It was great, and we hope to see you down the line.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's good stuff, Frank.
Boy, I'll
Good
tell
stuff.
you, it's
You know,
he
the
has
thing I
so
like.
many insights. What's your take?
Oh yeah.
What are the things that struck you?
Well, one thing that stood out in my mind is that he talked with a little bit more force than we have over the past 6 months or so about the direction of things and the way we think it's going to have to happen and the parity. I know we've talked about the parity that this has created. We talked about the transfer portal and how it's used and that sort of thing. But he brought out a lot of things that you and I have talking about the NFL model, having someone over college football, to control everything, and also I lost my train of thought a little bit there, but also, and I've talked about this numerous times, is when you look at the different ideas shaping up with the regional play and all that, is that he's looking at it from the perspective of WVU can hang in there with the money and that sort of thing, and this 12-team playoff it makes more room for all of us. And you brought up Indiana, which is a perfect example. I mean, how much different are they than West Virginia? And it puts us in a position to where we have a fighting chance. And with the parity, anybody can win. Now, I think that part of it's going to take a little bit of time because you're still going to have those blue bloods coming out on top in the end. But you look at the playoff with Boise State and Indiana, Arizona State. It does seem like West Virginia is in a good spot. We're okay. And I just thought several of his, him talking about Patrick Mahomes and that NIL, that's exactly the same thing. And we've talked about a lot of this stuff, and but he put it in a little bit better way of understanding it, and what because he knows so much more about it than what we do. But I also found interesting. I listened to Adam Silver this morning on a talk show, and he was talking about the NBA, and they were discussing college players and the G League and all that. And he gave some of the same exact viewpoints that Jed did, and talking about the NIL and the college player and that sort of thing. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I'm not going to go into all that, but right along the same lines. I mean, they had the same perspective on it, and just great insight. Of course, like I said, he knows so much more about it than we do. It's nice to hear somebody with the knowledge explain it like he does, and gives us hope. Gives us hope as Mountaineer fans.
Yeah, yeah, no question. And what we both appreciate, obviously, is the history of it all, and that you've got to put it in perspective. History, and I will tell you, and I told him this after the taping was over. I did not know that piece about the NFL, and that's really
Right.
important
I didn't either.
because in other words, a leader, not managing, but leading and saying, "Hey guys," because they're all guys, we can make a hell of.
That's the point I was trying to make here, and I forgot. I lost my train of thought. You and I talked about this one night on the show. How I believe that the SEC and the Big Ten will have to look at this and say, you know what? If we get everybody in this thing together, we're all going to benefit so much more than what we will benefit being isolationist. Keeping our two big conferences in charge of everything, we're costing ourselves money by doing that. And I said there's enough good teams out there other than those two conferences. You look outside those two conferences, there's enough good teams out there that really, I mean, if they were all working collectively, you just think the sky's the limit as far as revenue they could produce. with the regional games and a number of other things they could do as well, just like the NFL model. And I really think that he made a good point with that. And everybody working together on this thing. You have all the teams in 130, whatever there are, working together on it. Yeah, you're going to share the revenue, but the revenue is going to be 10 times what it is now. And the NFL model clearly shows that. And you and I, like I said, we talked about that months ago. That hopefully the SEC and the Big Ten will look at it and say, you know what, we'd be better off if we had everybody involved in this thing and not just our two conferences.
Mm-hmm. The challenge is
by the way.
No. The challenge, Greg, is one of the things. Well, you said both of the things I'm going to repeat, and that is it takes time, and you have to have a leader. There is no czar right now. There is no Pete Rozelle, and Charlie Baker in the NCAA is probably neither the organization nor the executive director president is the person to do that. But I'll tell you what, you probably read this, and I'm sure fans have read this, that it's starting again. He talked about you're going to have conference ESPN and conference Fox. And if you look at what's happening at North Carolina now with Bill Belichick coming there, now the networks are fighting over who's going to get North Carolina. And what's really important is ESPN wants them to bolt the ACC and go to the SEC so that ESPN can telecast them. And so, I think what Jed did is I think he gave us a roadmap, just like getting in your car and going somewhere. It's one thing to get in your car, in Oak Hill and go to Charleston. It's another thing to go to Atlanta. And this is an Atlanta trip, maybe a San Francisco trip. It's going to take a lot longer. I might mention too, before I forget, and I shouldn't, I want to put a shout out to Mark Parsons and John Antonik for doing the background work, for enabling us to have Jed on the show. We really appreciate that. And almost all of our guests are guests that, basically are delivered to us, and we appreciate that. And one of the things that's a real blessing is that some of our past guests now on the show, former WVU football players, are working with each other to get their buddies and folks they know on the team. And we'll talk more about it in a few minutes. A good example is Bo Orlando, the great Hall of Famer defensive back, and also played in the NFL, who's going to be our guest next week.
Yep. And I can tell you from experience, getting the guests is the hardest thing to do. Having my own show there for a while, trying to get guests, and not that people were negative about it or didn't want to do it. It was getting in touch with people, reaching people, and having contacts and that sort of thing. And of course, my contact list is limited, and it was tough to get them. And that's a hard job to do right there. And what will we do without those guys? And speaking of those guys, Frank, got the pleasure of talking to another one of our cohorts, Mike Dunlap, today. Spoke to him by phone, and he is sounding much, much, much better than he did the last time I talked to him. He really sounded good and said he was feeling a lot better. So particular about that, he said he was excited to get back on the show with us sometime. And I said, we'll more than happily have you. So
Mike is, for those of you who don't know, he had a spill at home, and it was a very serious accident, and he's been in the hospital since. And as you notice, there's a blank above Greg there. Mickey Plumley actually was going to be at my home tonight. He was going to be in another room being on the show, but he has a stomach virus that I think was food related, might have been food poisoning. At any rate, the bottom line, he couldn't be with us tonight. We want Mickey to come back next week, and we wish him the very best. So, that's we always we try to get through, and we cobbled the show, but cobbled together the show. But
last month and a half has been tough on this crew. I tell you what, been a rough road to hoe here for the while.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But the other thing I would mention, and we've said this before, and I know it's sensitive, but I think for me, one of the things that Jed did was, we want to look at things as though everything's in a steady state. Everything's the same. Well, it's not. And so I've talked with so many fans who are just focused on, okay, who's WVU getting in the portal? This is a coaching change. The industry is changing to revenue sharing.
Yep.
Let's just see what shakes out we've said this before, over the spring practice, what happens during the spring game, what the coaching staff decides to do with portal number 2 after spring practice. It's going to take some time, and so I think that's something that's really important. But as Jed said over and over again, you probably couldn't have a better person, given the collection available, than Rich Rod, because he's seasoned. He's been around. He's been to multiple schools. He saw the Pac-12. He saw the Big Ten in his previous operations, and also obviously at West Virginia in the Big East. But it's what he opened my eyes about the importance. I knew the revenue sharing was important, but I really didn't take it, Greg. I want to get your take on it, that it could be this leveling agent versus the Ohio State, the Texases, and the Texas A&M spending as much money as getting as much money and spending it all. And there we are. We can't compete with them. But this revenue sharing with essentially a cap makes it, and the expanded football playoff, it opens it up.
Yep. And it's like I said, the NFL model. If you look at the NFL, and like he said, he went from this much to this much in a few short years, and has a goal of upping it by 3 or 4 more billion. And you see some of the things they're doing with the overseas games and things like that. You can't argue with that model. I mean, my goodness, look at the success and the competitive nature. You look at why do people like football in general, first of all. But if it weren't competitive, I don't think people would watch quite as much. And, you look at the NFL, and, there's every year 4, 5, 6 teams, 7 teams you think could probably win the Super Bowl. And, if Kansas City wasn't playing. But anyway, you look at that parity, if you will. That's kind of what's created at it. It allows them to pay the big money for the superstar, but they have other money to get other players, but they have to stay under that cap. And, that makes it equal for everybody, more or less. And, it's just a matter of how you choose your players and that sort of thing. So I think, again, the same thing's coming in college football. And, like he said, the collective bargaining, unionization, whatever you want to call it, is coming. And, there has to be something in place like that, to keep it competitive, make it fair for everyone. And again, I think when you look at the SEC and the Big Ten, they've got to look at it too and say, this will benefit us. And I mean, that's the only way they're going to do it, is if they can see the benefit for themselves. So again, we've got to have somebody that can go in and show them the benefit of it, like the NFL. And I've said all along that I think the NFL model is where we're heading. It may not be exact, but it's going to be close. And I think these conferences are going to be blown up. There's not going to be conferences, if you will. And I think it's going to be divisions and playoffs through the divisions and that sort of thing. And like you said, the money thing, that's a great for teams, places like WVU, Indiana, other places where it makes us not totally on the same ground, but close to the same ground as Ohio State, Michigan State, Notre Dame. Gives us an opportunity anyway to be right there with them and get players and be able to compete. So I think what he's saying, I hope, is spot on with what happens. And but Frank, I'll be honest, it's got to happen. I mean, something has to change, or it's going to be a mess. And it's already a mess. It's going to be a worse mess. And I think if you look at it, from a business person's perspective, which I'm not, but if I were looking at it, I would say, if we continue down this path and we have Ohio State, Notre Dame, Alabama, Georgia, every year winning the thing, and every year in that playoff, these same teams, people will get tired of that. I've heard them talking yesterday on TV about how everybody's sick of the Chiefs. Everybody's Chief weary, and people get tired of seeing the same people win over and over and over again. They want to see different teams, and I think that's why that was so appealing this year, because you had a few different teams in there that you wouldn't normally be watching. And I just think it's something has to happen, and I think I'll look at it, from a business perspective, it just makes sense. You get everybody involved, you give everybody a chance, you make it equal and fair for everyone. Fan involvement is going to be much, much higher, I think, if you go that route.
Yeah, as he said, it's with the 14 playoff, it was the Blue
Yeah.
Blood Bowl, and it was going to be the same teams.
Every year.
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone like a Nick Saban could play the role of czar because he has so much respect, and he's also
Yep.
uber smart to
Yep.
be able to get this thing going. And the complexity is greater than when Pete Rozelle did it with the NFL, because for the most part, the networks weren't really competing with each other.
Right.
CBS was broadcasting, NBC broadcasting, ABC to a bit, the NFL games, but later. But now you got to make sure that Fox and ESPN can see this to their benefit. If we do it this way, media titans, you're going to make more money too, because he's right.
It's going to help him. That's right. It's going to help them too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll eventually happen. Now, wanted to switch. I hate to say it, but if you look at the crawler, and I'm sure folks watching have looked at that.
I got it on TV.
yeah. You really we haven't gotten much of your thoughts. A bit last week about. And people are asking, we knocked off 3 top 10 teams. We were going great guns, even without DeVries. What's going on?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things are happening. I think are a little fatigued, which I know, and I always fuss about that. I'm like, they're 20 years old. How can they get fatigued? I think that teams are figuring out a little bit that we don't have a ton of weapons on the scoring end. And, I watched them play Houston last week. I'm watching them play Houston tonight. They're doing the same thing whenever Javon Small had the ball and we ball screen for him. All they do is jump and double team him. And basically what they're doing is taking him out of the game. And, that's our other guys just aren't stepping up yet. And somebody's got to step up and start scoring a little bit to eliminate that. And we haven't been doing that. And, we're struggling offensively to score. And, a lot of that is they're double teaming Small. And he used to open up everything and with his scoring, and they had to pay such attention to him, it left other people wide open. But now they're double teaming him and making him give up the ball. And we're not the people that are getting the ball are just not cashing in. They're just not scoring. And I think that's the biggest part is teams have figured out how to defend us a little bit with the limited number of offensive weapons that we have. And, we play pretty good defense, but against a team like Houston, for example, man, I'm telling you what, those guys are good. My goodness. And it's hard to defend them. Now, we did lose a couple of games that teams that weren't hard to defend and we should have beat, but we score 13, 14 points a half. That's not going to cut it. Just like tonight, I think we have 19, I believe, in half, 39, 19, I believe. You can't win a big time college basketball game scoring 19 points and a half. You might win a high school game like that, but you're not going to win a college game. And we're just struggling so much on the offensive side. And, when you do that too, I learned this from experience. When you're not scoring, when you're not hitting baskets, it deflates you and your defense suffers because of it, but you're just not as aggressive into it when you score regularly. You start missing shots. You go down 8, and then you're down 12, and then you're down 16 before you know it. It just kind of takes air out of you, and that's happened to us too. You can just see it just looks like our intensity level just falls off whenever we can't score, and we've been struggling scoring. And that's the big problem right now. I think teams have figured out how to defend us a little bit.
Yeah, and if you look at it from maybe given your comments from a little different perspective from the way we were looking at it earlier, DeVries is really putting the Humpty Dumpty back on the wall. He's doing a
Yeah.
great job. Nobody
Yep.
expected them to knock off two top 25 teams in that early season tournament. They did. Then they went to Kansas and beat them. But it's a long season, and we're shorthanded this
Yep.
year. We're going to be much stronger next year. In fact, three of his recruits just played in the McDonald's games, so they're highly thought of high school players. All the players this year, except one, I think maybe two, came through the portal. They're good players. They're playing well
Yep.
together. It was the Kansas State game that was a little bit of a shocker because they were the Wildcats were struggling so much.
Yeah.
But and that also, if we turn the page to on the women's side, they went to
Same
Arizona, heavy favorite, and Arizona just jumped out and went on a run, 10,
thing.
15-point run, and that was the game. And I
Yep.
think that Coach Kellogg has a good perspective on it. We can dwell on that, but if you look at it from another perspective, we're winning three, losing one, not winning one, losing three. And I looked at the
Right.
forward schedule for the Lady Mountaineers, and it looks very favorable. They'll hang in there too. I think for the men, we're just gonna obviously support them.
Oh yeah.
They're playing well, but one of the points you made, Greg, is so important, and that is that obviously the offense and defense, they are connected, and when you're not hitting
Oh
your
yeah.
shots,
Yeah.
it's tough to remain a top 20 defensive club as
Yeah.
WVU was. Tough,
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's hard to like I said, it just sucks all the air out of you, and your intensity level just tends to fall off when when you just miss shot after shot after shot. And watching this game, um, not all of them are bad shots. I mean, they've had some awful good looks at it. They're just not making it. And uh, you know, all you can do there is just keep shooting it and hope you start making it at some point. And that hasn't happened. And guys who were hitting shots early in the season um, are not hitting them now, and that
Yeah.
made it. It makes it tough. If you're defending WVU and you're doing the double team on the ball and that sort of thing, that's all well and good. But if the team starts hitting shots, other people start making buckets, they're going to get out of that. And you have to force them out of it, and we have just not been able to do that. We've
Yeah.
we just not hitting the baskets, and you got to make baskets. That's the name of the basketball. You got to put it in the hoop, and
Yeah.
we're not doing that right now. So hopefully, you hope that this is just a bump in the road, and that they fight through it, and you don't want it to get psychological, but hopefully they start making those shots again, and they'll be okay. Yeah, and both Coach Kellogg and Coach DeVries talked about night in, night out in the Big 12. You got to bring it. And I think some of these guys are finding that tough to do, even on the ladies' side. That you're not getting these like your pre-conference games. You don't get those when the conference schedule starts. You get a tough team every night, and every team in that conference can beat you, and you got to come out, full steam ahead. And I think both the teams have had a problem with that. I think the intensity level. I know I watched the game against Arizona State in the men's side. We looked like, I mean, we were just so sluggish and so a step behind everything. And, I think that was, the fatigue, sickness, whatever excuse you want to give. But you can't do that, or Arizona State beat you, which is what they did. Kansas State, same way. You got to go in there with intensity. And, in the Kansas State game is a lot like this Houston game here. We were down so much to begin with, we just couldn't come back. I mean, we especially not shooting the ball real well, and our percentage was in the 20s, and you're just not going to win doing that. And in a conference like this, like I said, you got to be ready to go every night, and in any basketball game, you got to make shots if you want to have a chance. And we're just not doing that right now. So hopefully it's a bump in the road, and they'll get that ironed out, and start making those shots again, because we really enjoyed it when they were good. A lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as tough as the Big Ten football is, the Big Ten basketball is equally, if not more, difficult. And when you look at teams like Iowa State, and as we saw, Arizona didn't look so good earlier in the season. They're looking really good. They beat the Cyclones the other night.
Yep.
Kansas is still up there. They look, they're a little bit shaky at times,
Well,
yeah, it's a good
they
conference.
gave the game away the other night against Houston. I think I was telling you about it. They had
Yeah,
Houston beat, just handed it back to them. So yeah, they're a pretty good team, and they're playing well. And you look, I mean, yeah, you look at that conference top to bottom. There's some really good basketball teams in there. Um, I can't believe that Houston won't contend for the championship, because they're just that good. But Kansas is right up there, Iowa State's right up there, and all these teams, Arizona, um, they seem to be, unfortunately, me watching and trying to keep up with them, seems to be like all those teams are getting better, and West Virginia's going the opposite direction. So
yeah, yeah.
that's worrisome. Yeah,
But again, it's a long season, and we haven't even talked about Baylor
right.
yet. They're right up there too. And so, at any rate, we just got to hang in there. Again, it's putting Humpty Dumpty back on the wall, both in football and basketball. Got the right head coaches to do what they're doing.
Yep.
And as we said a couple weeks ago, won't be long before we'll be adding WVU Mountaineer baseball to the mix, and we always
Yep.
get excited about doing that. Looking at the clock here, it's a little bit after 8, and maybe we should transition, talk a bit about our guest for next week. I would imagine you had a chance to attend games at Mountaineer up in Morgantown to watch Bo Orlando play. What,
Absolutely.
yeah, what did you think about as Darren puts up the graphic for next week? What was it like watching Bo play for the Mountaineers?
He was one of those guys that when you go watch a game, it always kind of stood out to you. You sit there and watch, and watching on TV don't do it justice. But I can remember watching Pac-Man Jones, and thinking the same thing. I thought about Bo Orlando, and that was, he was always around the ball, no matter what. And Bo Orlando would hit you. He was a wicked hitter in that defensive backfield, and teams didn't like, they didn't like catching the ball in front of him, because he would put a hit on you. And that's the biggest thing I remember about him, is just how hard he hit, and the fact that he was always close to the ball. He was a heck of a player, and so much fun to watch. Yeah, and I watched him a lot back then. I used to go to all the games, and I watched him a lot, and you could always count on him. He wasn't going to screw it up back there. But yeah, he was a heck of a player. And
Yeah,
I think probably what he's most noted for was his ability to hit you hard and knock your head off. That was his thing. He was man. He would hit you. He was good.
yeah, and
Yeah.
but in terms of stature, one of those guys. I think he played at 5'10", maybe
Yeah,
175.
it wasn't
But
real big.
yeah, but he was just great. And for those of you, and there's Bo, both today and in his playing career there at West Virginia, he played from 85 to 88. So he played
Yep,
on some great Don Nehlen teams. He's in the
yep,
Hall of Fame. Had almost 150 tackles as a Mountaineer, and then went on to have a tremendous NFL career, 10 years.
yeah.
Probably most people know him playing for the old Houston Oilers. He played six
Oilers.
years for the Oilers, 2 years for the Chargers, but also the Bengals, and ended up as a Berwick, Pennsylvania kid, ended up with the Steelers his last year. And it's interesting. I talked with Bo the other day, and he's now athletic director at the high school he graduated from. So
Oh,
he's
okay.
the, isn't that some? He's the AD at Berwick High up in Pennsylvania. And I mean, for people who are not familiar with Bo, they knew the name. You're really going to enjoy him next week. He's loquacious, engaging, just really positive. And so we'll talk about his days as a Mountaineer. Greg, obviously, his days in the NFL, and then get
Yep.
his take on the current Mountaineers. But we're really looking forward. Next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock as usual. Our guest will be the great, and I mean that, the great Orlando. You've said it a million times. Another one of those football alums you'd like to have as a brother, a next door neighbor, an
Yep.
employee, a
Yep.
boss. He's done such a great job, not only as a football player but in life.
Yep. Yep. We talk about that all the time. These guys that we've had on, the accomplishments they had after football are amazing in their own right. Let alone the fact they, may play 10 years in NFL, or they may play 4 at WVU and move on. Always some great stories from these guys, from what they've done since their playing days, and what contributions they've made to society. It's always amazing and always fun to hear, and to hook up with these guys. And like I said, this is fun for me because I was a season ticket holder back in 85 through 88 for sure, and I went to all these games and got to see these guys play and just marveled at them then. And I told my brother one day not long ago. Brian Joswiak had sent us a bunch of stuff for our auction we had. We're raising money for our veterans place up there, and it sent us a nice note in there, and just sent us a bunch of extra things. And I told my brother, I said, I never would have dreamed back in 85, 86, 87 that I would be talking to these people and getting to know them. And I said, it's amazing to see their accomplishments and all that they've done since they, gave up football. It's just been amazing. And Bo Orlando is no different. He was, I loved watching him play, watched a bunch of his games, and I can't wait to talk to him. It's going to be a blast.
Yeah, it's a thrill for us, and it's so enjoyable. A learning experience too, because obviously, as we get ready for interviews, we do research on these guys, and you always learn something you didn't know before, and that's fun too. So, and we learn a lot from what they say and why they're thinking the way they are. And what we try to do, obviously, is go back and forth over the eras, and we've got a great lineup coming up for you in the next month or so. So take us home, Mr. Christ. We are done for the night.
Yep, sounds good. And I'm looking forward to all these great guests that's been lined up for us. We again appreciate those guys and for hooking us up with these guests. And it just gets better every week. It gets more fun each week as we go. And looking so forward to it. But for everybody out there watching, we certainly appreciate you. We appreciate Darren McGuffin for getting us hooked up here on the New River Network. We appreciate that, and it expands our viewership a little bit, we hope. And we appreciate everybody for tuning in, checking us out. We thank Jed Drenning for being gracious with his time, giving Frank that great interview. That was very insightful and very educational, and we appreciate him for doing that for us. But again, we thank you for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night right here on the Mountaineer Locker Room, then and now on the New River Network. See you then.